It's hard to follow that, and like Mike, I had to change things after this morning and this afternoon. I saw the same TV show Caroline was referring to, Context,
Yes.
and it talked a lot about the ISIS factor and what was going on in the Middle East.
Yes.
We now have the largest refugee displaced person problem in the history of the world. Over 10 million people are now displaced because of ISIS. And they talked to some fathers who were worried about their children, some daughters who were worried about their fathers. And I often wonder what happens to the fathers in this country whose children have gone over to serve with ISIS. Why do these separations have to happen? It's nothing new, actually. Go back to the book of Exodus. We've talked about Moses the last couple of weeks. But one thing we tend to forget about when we talk about Moses and going to the promised land and going through the 40-year trek in the desert, we seem to forget that Moses was married. Moses had a wife and 2 sons. And when God first sent him to Egypt, he took his wife and 2 sons with him, according to Exodus 4. But God was not happy with this. So, perhaps because his wife was a Midianite and not Hebrew, well, I don't know. But anyway, Moses sent his wife and sons back. To my knowledge, he never saw them again. 40 years wandering in the desert, wondering what happened to his sons, would be quite a challenge.
Yes.
Moses spent his life serving God. Now, he wasn't perfect. When he was in Egypt, he probably served idols, but God didn't seem to hold that against him. When he was about 40, he murdered an Egyptian, and God didn't seem to hold that against him. He went where God told him to go. He led the Hebrews through 40 years in the wilderness. A real puzzling situation because he's been back and forth to Midian at least twice, and his father-in-law met him 3 months after they left Egypt from Midian. But he still spent 40 years because God wanted the Hebrews to understand that they needed God every day, and not just once. Moses served God faithfully for a long time. And yet, according to Numbers 20, when Moses got angry and struck the rock to bring out water, rather than speaking to the rock as God had instructed, God did hold it against him and told him that he would never enter into the promised land. Now, Moses apparently wrote or compiled the first 5 books of the Bible, the laws of God, and the journeys of the Hebrews through the wilderness. A young man who was 20 years of age when the journey began, with the name of Hosea, who Moses later renamed Joshua, became one of Moses' main allies and lieutenants. And it was to him was left the journey beyond Mount Nebo, where Moses died, into the promised land. And the next book in the Bible, the book of Joshua, tells about that story, about crossing the Jordan and getting into the promised land, about the battles that had to be fought. Pastor Todd this morning talked about truth. What is truth? And one of the problems with reading the Bible is the fact that there are differences in the Bibles. This is why it says in Thessalonians to test everything. I have a Bible at home in which the book of Joshua ends at chapter 10. Most Bibles have 24 chapters. There's a difference. Therefore, one has to be careful about what one reads and the type of book in which it's read. But regardless of the historicity, there are a number of things which have to be looked at and lessons which can be learned from this. First of all, Moses did mighty deeds for God. He walked with God for a long time, did God's bidding. And yet the one time he did not follow God, it was held against him, and there was punishment. You see, it's not by what we do, it's by how we follow God that really counts. The second thing is that God promised Abraham to give him the land from the Nile River to the Euphrates. Promised it to his descendants. However, the people who lived in those lands weren't quite as congenial. They didn't want to give it up. Therefore, the Hebrews had to fight to get the lands that God had promised them. If we want the promises God has for us in this earth or beyond, we have to fight for them. We have to be willing to put up a battle for them sometimes. Be willing to stand for what God tells us to stand for.
Yes.
Because the one time that God tells us something that we don't do it, could be the time it's held against us.
Yes.
Third thing is that Aaron was with Moses at Kadesh when they struck the stone rather than speaking to the stone. Now, Aaron didn't strike anything. Aaron wasn't told by God to speak to the stone, but he was there. And it was held against him too. He also did not cross into the promised land. Sometimes it's not what we do. It's where we are and who we associate with. It's what they do that's held against us. That's why it's told to pick your friends and associate with the right people. It says in the Bible that God forgives sin. And that's true. But it never says in the Bible that the devil forgives sin. If you go to the book of Jude, you'll see that in that book, it talks about the archangel Michael wrestling with Satan for the body of Moses. According to the Jewish literature, the reason for this is that Satan is the god of murderers. And the fact that Moses murdered an Egyptian was never forgotten by Satan. Therefore, he laid claim to Moses' body. And Michael had to wrestle him on God's behalf for his servant. Just something to think about, because when we do things and we say to God to forgive us, that's fine. But sometimes Satan doesn't forget or forgive. When we think of fathers and think of Father's Day and the separations of children and parents as they grow up, as they get older, as they naturally move along, sometimes there's a sadness there. Sometimes you're glad to see them get on with their lives. But the point is, there are separations. There are always going to be good separations. But there are so many bad separations that we have to wonder why sometimes these happen. And they happen because freedom in this world has to be brought with a price. And sometimes that price is a separation of families. See, the only real freedom we're ever going to find is the freedom that real truth will give you. Jesus said, the truth will set you free. Even that truth came with a price and had to be paid for. Something we should never forget, and something we should always think about.